Why is it that we sometimes play like gods and sometimes play like scrubs? If we have acquired a certain level of skill, then what is going on in the brain that could explain having an off day? VTRcomics asked this question in my last Neuroscientist Explains video, and I found it to be a very interesting question to think about. I'm going to preface this video by saying that it's probably going to be a bit more complex than the previous videos, and thus probably won't be as successful with the algorithm. So if you'd like to support me, subscribing and sharing these videos really helps my channel's growth. So the core of the question really is, what is the source of the variability in our performance from day to day? This is especially interesting since we can be playing poorly even when we feel great, and playing great even when we feel like shit. Sometimes it's so subconscious that we wouldn't even be able to tell that we're playing bad if the game wasn't killing us. Or maybe you've experienced not realizing that you're playing on a lower difficulty, and until you realize, you think you're playing like an absolute god. See, the brain doesn't necessarily have an accurate representation of itself. In the physical world, it represents its own movements by internally generating an I'm doing this signal called an efferent copy. But when functioning in the greater uncertainty of the virtual world, the brain more heavily depends on external signals from the environment to provide it data about reality, including external data about its own performance. Now, I think this is a good question to take to the reinforcement learning lens. Reinforcement learning is a type of machine learning that was inspired by early psychological works. TLDR, animals are able to connect arbitrary stimuli such as a bell to future reward or punishment, and we call this classical conditioning. And if you reward or punish certain behaviors, they will become more or less likely respectively, and this is called operant conditioning. At the simplest level, classical conditioning explains why you get so anxious when you hear the beep beep of having dangerously low health. And if you're like me and immediately pull out the chain gun shield when you hear it, that is because this behavior has been learned through operant conditioning. So hold on tight, we're about to get into the complex stuff. In the reinforcement learning framework, you or the AI get an input such as the state of the environment and compute what action to take. So for example, perhaps you see a blood maker and a marauder and you need to decide whether to pull out the ballista or the precision bolt. Now in this decision, noise or irrelevant aspects also need to be taken into consideration. In the brain, there are sources of noise at every level, from the cellular level to the networks level to even the scale of your muscles. This isn't always a bad thing though. In reinforcement learning algorithms, there is some intrinsic noise needed for exploring novel actions, and some of the biggest developments in the field are about when and how to be noisy in our action selection. There is something called the exploration-exploitation trade-off, which is the trade-off between the probability of taking the action whose value you've experienced to be optimal so far, and the probability of taking an action whose value you're uncertain about. So for example, maybe in the Marauder Bloodmaker scenario, perhaps you usually exploit the tried and true strategy of PB Ballista, but now you're low on Ballista and Precision Bolt ammo. So instead, you decide to explore using sticky bombs, and you discover that it can actually land a Bloodmaker headshot pretty easily, while also being useful for getting splash damage on the Marauder at a distance. So exploration is important to have built into the system, and this ammo example may actually be why Doom Eternal intentionally restricts your ammo, to force you to explore and find the optimal actions. Shifting gears back to the brain, we also need to think about how the brain is a recurrent system, which in this case just means that the activity of the brain now is a function of the activity of the brain previously. This means that the input when gaming is not really just the current moment of the game, but also the current state of the brain. The state of the brain is unimaginably massive, from your mood to the memory that the buff totem spawns in this specific location. Everything going on in your brain right now is part of this enormous differential equation. A differential equation is just an equation for the changes in variables, where the changes in the variables are a function of the values of the variables themselves. So for example, the change in x equals 0.1 times negative x is a simple dynamical system. And similarly, the probability of you chainsawing a fodder right now is a function of how recently you've chainsawed a fodder. At its simple level, that's all a dynamical system or recurrent system or differential equation really is. So how does the equation in the brain turn input into action? Well, to grossly oversimplify the math, we can just say that your action at time t plus 1 is a function of the state of the brain at time t. But since dynamical systems are self-referencing, inputs to the system usually either decay or get amplified. So the delicate doom dance is about maintaining the balance of amplification and decay and knowing when to switch specific activity in the brain from one mode to another. From here we can start to get some actual answers. First of all, these kinds of dynamical systems are very sensitive to initial conditions. So for example, let's say you're a little distracted by something at work. Even if the effect is so subconscious that you don't explicitly realize it, it may still be having an effect on the state of your brain. This may mean that your brain needs to work extra hard to keep the dynamical system on the correct path to the optimal actions. In the context of noise, in order to maintain optimal performance, the brain needs to filter out the noise from the directions of the dynamical system that get amplified. So for example, if some random bug or mistake causes a bloodmaker to ignore your headshot, that noise can get amplified into frustration or rage, which itself can cause you to be more impulsive and further destabilize the system. Essentially, bullshit can become a positive feedback loop. In order to keep the system performing optimally, your brain needs to decay the noise and quite literally remove it from the system, which would equate to you ignoring the bugs and simply readjusting to the current situation. Something that I've noticed that I do is I actually assume the bugs are going to happen. When I go in for a blood punch, I assume it's not going to connect. When I shoot a marauder, I assume he's going to put up his shield. When you already take into account the prior probability of a bug, the dynamics of your brain will be primed towards taking the right actions in response to the bug, thus minimizing its effect. At this point, my learned policy in response to most bugs is to pull out the chain gun shield and just dash away, which may not be the most fun zone, but it keeps you in the action and lets you get right back to the fun. So I would claim that mental effort is the dynamical system of your brain trying to keep itself where it needs to be, which I believe is probably accomplished largely with neuromodulators such as acetylcholine and serotonin. For example, the mental effort of controlling the impulse to flame belch a single fodder so that you can use it when there's a crowd probably requires the inhibition of activity that promotes using the flame belch. But once the time becomes right, you need very fast amplification of that activity. This may be accomplished through acetylcholine and its proposed property of modulating synchronization between clusters of neurons. The dynamical system lens also explains why being nervous makes you play poorly, since anxiety generally corresponds to greater amplification of signal and therefore leads to impulsivity. It makes sense that we're biased towards being impulsive, since most actions require amplification. But if I'm able to calm myself down when I'm close to death, my chances of survival grow dramatically by avoiding this over-amplification. Next time you're playing and you're close to death, try to stay calm and literally ignore whatever bullshit happened, and you may be surprised by how much better you play. Sometimes ignoring the bullshit can be a bit too hard though, and in those cases I try really hard to find the humor in it, and that tends to help me minimize its lasting impact. On the topic of impulsivity though, this is actually very relevant to some of the research my colleagues are doing in the lab. In our projects, mice have to wait some time before making a decision. Now the question arises, why would the mouse ever make the decision prematurely? Why not just wait until it's definitely safe to make the decision? Especially since being premature is much more costly than overwaiting. So we would expect the natural drift in our timing to be to wait more and more and more. However, another thing to consider is that if we wait 10 minutes to use the flame belch, we'll actually be getting much less armor per minute than if we just used it around when it became available. So in order to balance this, it's important to keep our action time around the teaching signal. In fact, it makes sense to overweight on average, but skew our exploration towards being premature, since it provides a very clear teaching signal. Now, I don't know about you, but I often notice myself pressing the chainsaw literally a millisecond before it's ready. If this is real, perhaps it could be intentional exploration noise in your brain's internal timing dynamics. Perhaps this is how our brains evolved to maintain precise timing, by intentionally skewing exploration towards being premature, so we don't drift too far away from the teaching signal. And on a day we're playing poorly, it may simply be a function of over or under exploration. But my main answer to the original question, I would say, is this. I would interpret the times where you nonchalantly perform great as days where the noise is irrelevant, or what is sometimes called orthogonal to the direction the dynamical system is trying to go. For example, let's take Eternal's Fog, where there's a lot of uncertainty or noise in enemy location. It's very easy to experience a false positive, or thinking you see an enemy at a location where there isn't one. But if you've already memorized enemy location spawns, the noise is irrelevant because your brain can simply just amplify memorized information. The signal of the false positive was still there in the brain, but it was so easy to inhibit that the impact on the dynamical system decayed to nothing. However, during times where you're struggling, consciously or subconsciously, this would mean that the noise is very relevant to the task. For an extreme example, if there's loud construction that sounds really similar to enemy attacks and spawns, that's noise in the same direction the dynamical system is trying to go. So essentially, why you sometimes play like shit is about the actual computation that the brain is doing, and how difficult it is for the brain to transform the input into the appropriate output while ignoring internal and external noise, with many sources of noise being obvious, such as visual and auditory noise, but other sources being less obvious, such as the impact of your day at work or your frustration with a bug. You can probably already see how delicate the dynamical system is. It's impressive that it ever works well in the first place. But there's actually another important aspect of the system, which is differentiating the internal loop from input from the environment. The input stream from the environment includes things like pixels on the screen. However, the internal loop is the stuff that can be unstable. That's the mind. One theory of the neuromodulator serotonin is that it modulates two valves. It closes a valve in the internal loop, and it opens a valve in the stream from the environment. So essentially, it stops you from getting stuck in your head, and it engages you with the environment. Another related theory of serotonin is that it functions as uncertainty prediction error, similar to dopamine's role of reward prediction error, but unlike dopamine, which signals unexpected reward, serotonin is signaling unexpected uncertainty. Taking these theories together, unexpected uncertainty in Doom Eternal, such as running into a dangerous enemy where you didn't expect it, would stimulate serotonin release and engage you with the input stream from the game. You're probably also familiar with serotonin's most popular role as regulating mood, and this mechanism of eternal potentially releasing serotonin may be why an engaging session puts you in a good mood. This can also be a contributor to you playing like shit, however, since being too in your head can definitely impair your ability to absorb all the information coming at you from the game. I at least feel like I play much better when I'm not overthinking the situation or worrying too much about dying. Alright, thanks for watching. If you feel like you've learned something and you'd like me to make more of these videos, consider sharing it around. It takes a lot of time to make these, and it really helps keep me motivated when the video gets around. Till next time, generic outro.